Welcome back, Life Science learners, to another segment. We've looked at fertilization and implantation. It's important now for us to understand what is the process of development of that zygote after it's implanted. So we know that blastocyst has to attach onto the endometrium to stimulate the next process of development. So let's look at that process now. And so we're going to focus on the process of the development of the zygote post-implantation. And so we refer to that as the formation of the placenta and pregnancy and further development. So it's important that we understand what happens during pregnancy. And so pregnancy is a period that lasts for about 40 months and 40 weeks, my apologies, and it points to the development of how this ball of cell becomes this complex individual that develops within the female reproductive system. It's a diagram that has quite overwhelming to understand in terms of when we look at this, in terms of how does a small ball of cell develop into this complex young individual. Let's look at what happens. So all of this happens within a sac called the amniotic sac. So when we look at the amniotic sac, it is a layer of membrane that encloses this developing young fetus. A thin wall sac surrounds the fetus during pregnancy, and that we refer to as the amniotic membrane. This sac is filled with a liquid which is called amniotic fluid, which constantly surrounds the fetus. So within this amniotic sac, there is amniotic fluid surrounding that space between the baby or the fetus and the amniotic membrane. And this amniotic fluid plays an important role, which we'll discuss in a little while. It's important that the baby is enclosed in this membrane. Firstly, because the amniotic fluid protects the fetus from injury and dehydration. It also helps to regulate the temperature of the fetus. So figure out that when the baby develops, it's developing in this sac, and that sac is physically kind of disconnected from the mother because there's no direct attachment between the mother's blood supply and the fetus. So the fetus has to maintain its body temperature independently. And so we find that the amniotic sac plays an important role in regulating the temperature around this developing fetus. We also know that when we look at the further development, it is important that the baby remains hydrated and nourished with the outside being moist, or else we find that the baby can experience dehydration. From the outside, the amnion is a second sac called the chorion, which is also forms part of the placenta. So there is a chorionic layer which we will see in the next diagram. Okay, what is very important for us to understand is the structure of the placenta and its role during pregnancy and further development. So the placenta is a disc-shaped structure, and we'll look at how it looks like in the body in a bit, that contains a fetal vein and it contains fetal arteries, which are enclosed and connected within an umbilical cord. And this placenta contains chorionic villi or folds that connect into the endometrial lining. So this is an image which I will change my slide in a bit so that it gives you a context to what we're looking at. So I'm going to go back to this slide here. So here, this is an image that shows you the development of the placenta. So that's the placenta, and we're looking at how this image illustrates the details of that placenta. So it's a disc-shaped structure that connects into the internal maternal membrane. So here is the internal maternal endometrial lining in which this placenta connects the baby to, or the fetus to, the mother. So I'm going to step back a bit just to give you context to where we were. So if we take this placenta and we place it into the developing uterus of the mother, we see that this is the disc-shaped structure, and here you'll find the fetus on the upper side attached here. So that's just to give you a context to where we are. Okay, so let's look at the structure of the placenta. As I mentioned, it's a disc-shaped structure which is important in nourishing the developing fetus. The fetus receives the nutrition from the mother through the maternal blood flow, and this is again sinuses or spaces which allow for the maternal blood supply to exchange nutrients. So if we were to look at this space here, okay, as I mentioned, this end is the side in which the maternal blood supply is present. So you have your maternal veins and your maternal arteries here. And these carry nutrients and take away the waste products. We also know that the placenta is this structure that contains a whole lot of blood vessels that extend into the maternal sinuses or spaces. And from these you have the fetal arteries and the fetal veins that branch into these. And these allow for a network of capillaries to be able to exchange nutrients between the two blood supplies. So the maternal blood supply and the fetal blood supply show the process of exchange of nutrients. This happens through extensions called chorionic villi. So these finger-like projections extend between the spaces, and these allow for an increased surface area and maximum diffusion of nutrients between the maternal blood supply as well as the fetal blood supply. And this is what facilitates the exchange of nutrients between them. So in understanding the structure of the placenta, it's important that we know that products such as carbon dioxide and waste products from the fetal blood diffuse into the mother's blood supply. So we know that the baby during its development, or the fetus during its development, produces lots of waste products as well as carbon dioxide. And all of that has to diffuse back into the maternal blood supply so that that can be constantly removed. And so we see that this happens through the aid of the placenta. We also know that the baby or the fetus requires oxygen and nutrients, and that diffuses from the mother's blood supply into the fetal blood supply. This exchange of materials happens through what we call the umbilical cord, which contains your fetal veins and your fetal arteries. So when we look at the umbilical cord, it is an extension of the chorion which contains the fetal arteries and the vein. It is a long, flexible cord that extends from the abdomen of the fetus all the way to the placenta. The umbilical cord contains two umbilical arteries, and these arteries carry, importantly, deoxygenated fetal blood and waste. Examples: urea and carbon dioxide, which are produced by the fetus. It carries them back to the placenta. It contains one umbilical vein, and which brings the nutrients from and oxygen from the maternal blood supply to the fetus. So we see that you've got two umbilical veins, and you've got two umbilical arteries, my apologies, and you've got a single umbilical vein that allow for the exchange of nutrients as well as the exchange of waste products between the maternal blood supply and the fetal blood supply. So this image encapsulates what we've just discussed. So we're seeing that this is the fetal blood supply, and we're seeing the maternal blood side here, and we're looking at how the diffusion of carbon dioxide and urea occurs from the fetus to the mother, and below this we see the diffusion of nutrients, oxygen, antibodies, vitamins and water from the maternal blood supply into the fetus. And this is an important process that occurs that ensures that the baby remains healthy, waste products are removed, and can achieve the correct development through the exchange of nutrients and waste products between the fetal and maternal blood supply. The placenta also plays a very important role in the production of hormones. So during the first trimester, or the first few weeks of development, the fetus develops and produces or stimulates the production of progesterone. And that progesterone comes from a structure called the placenta. So we see that initially it's the development of the placenta that takes over the production of progesterone. And that progesterone is important in maintaining the lining of the endometrium and the attachment between the developing placenta and the maternal blood supply. So the placenta takes over the hormonal role of the ovaries around 12 weeks. Initially, the hormones produce progesterone, But once the placenta develops, it continues producing estrogen and progesterone for the remaining period of development inside the uterus. Estrogen will stimulate the growth of the uterus and the myometrium and the development of the mammary glands. And you'll find that it's important that the mammary glands develop during pregnancy in preparation for breastfeeding. We know that the placenta plays an important role in producing progesterone, as I mentioned earlier. And progesterone, its function is to maintain the endometrium, as well as to reduce the uterine contractions that potentially may occur during the process of gestation. Both estrogen and progesterone levels drop towards the end of the process of pregnancy. So let's try and understand the role of the placenta. So we said that the placenta is this disc-shaped structure. It is important in the production of hormones. It is also important in ensuring that there is the exchange of nutrients as well as the removal of waste products. We've just looked at the function of the placenta in terms of taking over the production of progesterone. And that is vital to maintaining pregnancy post the first 12 weeks. We often see that the placenta is crucial in maintaining the pregnancy post the 12 weeks because it takes on a very important function of producing progesterone. So let's look at the role of the placenta in hormonal control. So this image actually shows you the levels of hormones over the 9 months of development. So we're seeing the 9 months of development that happens within the uterus. We're also seeing this divided into 3 phases of development: the first trimester, the second trimester, and the third trimester. So essentially 12 weeks of development, and we look at that, and now we look at the structure of development and link that to hormones. So during the first trimester, we see that there is an increase in a hormone called human chorionic gonadotrophin, and that's again released from the chorion developing within the fetus. So when the fetus develops, we find that there's the chorionic layer, and that chorion stimulates the production of human chorionic gonadotrophin. So during the first 3 months of development, we see that there's an increase in human chorionic gonadotrophin. When we look at the other 2 hormones, which are illustrated in blue and green, and these are progesterone and estrogen, we see that there is a gradual increase in these 2 hormones from the first or during the first 3 months. When we look at the second trimester, we see that there is a decrease in the human chorionic gonadotrophin hormone, but we see that there is a significant increase, and now the release of progesterone and estrogen is from the development of the fetus. Earlier on in the first trimester, it was the ovaries that were responsible for the release of these hormones. However, in the second trimester, it is the development of the placenta that is responsible for the release of progesterone and estrogen. As we progress into the third trimester, we see that this is when probably the estrogen progesterone levels are the highest, and as we get towards the end of the gestation period or the development of the fetus within the uterus, we see that there is a preparation for pregnancy, and that is seen by a decrease in the levels of progesterone and estrogen, and that is then significant with the process of delivery and the birth of the baby. So guys, in this segment we've looked at an overview of the role of the placenta in terms of the hormones that are produced, its structure. What is significant was discussing the umbilical cord and its structure. Before we wrap up, I'd like to show you what an image looks like of a placenta. And if we look at this, it shows you the placenta, and it shows you a vascularized membrane with lots of blood vessels. We also see a very thick rubber-like umbilical cord, and it is within this umbilical cord that we have the umbilical veins and arteries. So yes, as much as this looks very rich in blood supply, it also contains all the waste products that have accumulated within the period. So this is the structure that is removed at the end during the afterbirth, after the delivery of a baby has taken place. So that's a wrap of the placenta and the umbilical cord. Guys, you've been focused, you've been an attentive class. You deserve a break. Let's get into a short break, stretch a bit, and I'll see you at the end of that break.